Great. So yeah, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat window as we go along. But yeah, we'll be having group discussion at the end. So hello everyone, I'm Matt. I've been in the village about 10 years. I stay up on the estate in the old hospital building, and spent about 15 years working in the oil and gas industry as an engineer, and then about 5 years ago I gave it up to retrain as an architect. So I'm currently a student at RGU doing my masters. I've also trained as a passive house designer. I'm also training as a retrofit coordinator. We'll try and explain what that is later. And I also run a student climate action group at the uni. And essentially last year, when I was on my placement year for my course, I spent a lot of time researching climate change, reading papers and books, doing my own research. Ken.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Ken Gordon. I've been in the village with my wife for 33 years now. I'm a mechanical engineer as well, and I have done a bit in the oil and gas, but bits and pieces in all sorts of other industries. My present interest is in ground source heat pumps, so working to see how we can best employ those. And as Matt said, I've been with him on this Community Energy Scotland webinar session that we've been doing since last September, where we got lots of great ideas on what we could do in the community, but decided that rather than just Matt and Ken deciding what we should do, we would set up this zero carbon Daviot to allow everybody in the community to, find out what we've learned and to, to be able to make some decisions going forward. I've also been an observer of the Scotland's Climate Assembly, which is going on in Edinburgh at the moment. Well, it's going on Zoom at the moment, but and it's some very interesting sessions, and we'll talk about that a wee bit later. So that's me.
Thanks, Ken. So I'm just going to talk about some sort of facts about climate change, starting with this image, which really kind of just demonstrates that the effects are here with us already. This is a picture of Greenland taken in 2019, and this was the normal situation 10, 15 years ago would have been that everything in this photo would have been white, absolutely everything. So they're seeing changes up there. We are seeing changes in our region as well, but not as perhaps not as obvious, but we're seeing them nonetheless. So we know that this is linked to increasing levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So CO2 levels are measured in parts per million. And although, people will talk about various cycles of levels of CO2 in the history of the Earth, for the last 800,000 years, this graph from NASA shows you that CO2 levels have been below 300 parts per million. And it's only since the Industrial Revolution in the 1860s that, the 19th century generally, that CO2 levels have started to rise. And so now we're way above 300 parts per million. And right now we're at about 415. And of course, that's linked to our use of fossil fuels as well as other sources. So the overall effect is increasing temperatures on the Earth, and we passed 1 degree Celsius increase in 2015, or was it 2018? So yeah, the effects are definitely with us. And these are some of the projected effects. So this comes from Keep Scotland Beautiful. They have a climate literacy guide, which is excellent. I'd encourage people to have a look. They do run courses as well in climate literacy. But these are largely some of the effects. And you know, we know things like the ice caps melting will increase sea level, but you know, that's certainly not the limit of it. And for me, I guess the most significant, the biggest things that are going to cause the most disruption are going to be effects to the food chain. So we know that there are threats to insects and pollinators that could have knock-on effects for the food chain. So we're at 1 degree now, and potentially we're trying to limit ourselves to only 2 degrees, but you can see there's up to a 30% risk of species loss. So these facts here just show in even more depth the difference between 1.5 degrees warming and 2 degrees warming. And you can see, I mean, there's various statistics here, but the species loss regarding insects, you know, the risks jump from 6% to 18% just from going from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. So yeah, all the links to these are available in the slides, and they'll be available to everyone afterwards. So more locally, what are we seeing in Scotland? Well, you may not see it, but obviously the sea level rise, we are seeing temperature fluctuations. And I mean, more generally, everyone realizes that the winters are not nearly as bad as even when I moved here 10 years ago. And there are really significant changes in the biodiversity of the Aberdeenshire region. So yeah, the effects are definitely here. So what's being done about it? So in 1988, the United Nations recognized that the output of fossil fuels and the increases in CO2 could have damaging effects to Earth's atmosphere and the ecosystem. And so they assembled what's called the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this was an independent panel of scientists from all member countries, and today there are thousands of scientists from over 120 countries. And every year they release reports on current projections, the current state of the climate, using the best science available. And it's worth saying, you know, that scientists are a conservative bunch. So so when they peer review these things, you know, a paper might have 100 different facts in it, but they will share it with scientists from other nations. And if they don't all agree on every fact in that paper, it won't be published. Excuse me. So when you read their documents, you know that it's been independently verified by a lot of very clever people, for want of a better word. In 2015, you've probably heard of the Paris Agreement, and that came about as a result of COP21 in Paris in 2015. Where all 196 member countries signed up and agreed to limit global warming to 2 degrees and to pursue 1.5 degrees. Now, that was in 2015, and to bring that forward, the idea was that each country would determine what's called a nationally determined contribution. So the scientists worked out a budget of carbon that we could release into the atmosphere that would keep us within 2 degrees, and they calculated it for 1.5 degrees as well. And then nationally determined contributions basically worked out of that global budget how much each country could allow itself. In 2018, the IPCC released Special Report 15, which highlighted essentially that no nations on the planet had set legally binding or government policies that complied with those nationally determined contributions. And that still remains a fact, that there's no governments on the planet that have actually made policy commitments that are in line with their legal requirements under the Paris Agreement. So in the UK, we have the Committee on Climate Change. So this is an independent body of scientists that basically advise government, and they again release reports every year, and you'll hear that the government target is to be net zero by 2050. But it's important to note that the Committee on Climate Change, their carbon budget does not include figures on aviation and shipping. So it needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. And of course, the Scottish Government have our own, we have our own commitments as well, outlined by Holyrood, which set us on target for net zero by 2045. But I don't want you to just take my word for it. This is a video presented. This is Professor Kevin Anderson. He presented to the Scottish Climate Assembly, which Ken's going to talk about. So we're just going to watch 6 minutes of this, where he outlines some of the sort of bare bones science. Now, please bear with me a second, because sometimes I get the audio wrong on this. I may have to stop it a second, restart it. Bear me a moment. Again, if you could just give me a thumbs up if you can't hear this.
Hello, my name is Kevin Anderson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change, and I previously worked for a decade as an engineer in the oil and gas industry, mostly out of Aberdeen on the Bray A and Bray B oil platforms. What I want to do over the next few minutes is outline what the maths and the science tell us about Scotland's fair and effective contribution to the Paris Agreement, and how this shapes our choice of policies. Now, I start by taking the Paris 1.5 and 2 degrees C temperature rise as framing our climate emergency. My focus then is on cutting emissions from our use of energy, from cars to planes, homes to industry. I stick to the maths and the science and the temperature and equity commitments embedded in the Paris Agreement, and I don't pander to short-term politics and economics. All the analysis underpinning this presentation is based on a peer-reviewed paper which is linked to in the notes. So although we start from the same science, I'll be outlining far more rapid cuts in emissions and a much more challenging policy agenda than you'll have heard about so far. So what does the science tell us about the Paris temperature commitments? Well, it's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we emit that really matters, not emission reductions far off in 2045 or 2050. It's the area under the curve we need to focus on, what we call the carbon budget. And this brings the time frame for rapidly cutting emissions to between now and 2030, just over the next decade. If instead we focus on 2045, and in the interim we expand our airports and we build more roads and we drive further, then we pass an impossible burden onto our children. And based on the latest science report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we know that we have a set global carbon pie, a set global budget, and that's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit from now out to forever. And it's round about a little over 600 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. Now that means very little to most of us, but that's about 18 years of current emissions at a global level before we've actually used up all of that budget. But before discussing what this means for Scotland, we have to recognise where we are today. Now, across the 20th century, carbon dioxide emissions continued to rise. And in the 1980s, the politicians at the time asked the scientists to produce a report on climate change. This is the first major report, and it was published in 1990. But despite clear scientific evidence over the intervening 3 decades about the impacts of climate change, our emissions have just continued to rise, and today are 60%, over 60% higher than they were in 1990. But what we often hear is, isn't the UK showing leadership? Now, we get claims like, well, the emissions in the UK are down by 45% since 1990. That's something we often hear. But if you include aviation and shipping emissions, and indeed the emissions from our imports and exports, then that fall is not 45%, but actually it's only 10% over 30 years. That's less than 0.5% every single year. But what about Scotland? Well, look at Scotland's consumption emissions. That's its total carbon footprint over the last 20 years. And you'll see there's been no meaningful reduction over that full 20-year period. So in 30 years, since the first IPCC report, despite a lot of hot air about UK and Scottish leadership, the reality of the numbers tells a very different story. There is no meaningful decoupling. Scotland's carbon footprint per person, okay, it's less than the people in the US, but it's over twice the global average. It's 70% higher than the average Chinese person, 6 times higher than the average Indian person, and 20 times higher than a Nigerian citizen. But if we've achieved so little, how is it that we have such enthusiasm about the future? Well, we've found a way to avoid making our fair cut in emissions today, and that is by assuming that in the second half of the century, after 2050, our children and our children's children will find a way to suck huge quantities of carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and store it apparently safely underground somewhere. But these negative emission technologies are still mostly in the imagination of professors and a few very small pilot schemes around the world. Yet today already our policies assume that these will work at huge planetary scale. Let's put these negative emissions to one side though and start to refocus again back on Scotland. How big is Scotland's fair carbon budget? Well, going back to the earlier global carbon pie, we can divide that between the developing, the poorer countries, and the developed countries, the richer countries. We can then ask how much of the richer countries' slice should Scotland actually get? We estimate Scotland's fair Paris carbon budget to be between 250 and 350 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, again from 2020 out to the end of the century and beyond. That's about 6 to 9 years of Scotland's current emissions before it exceeds its Paris commitments. If we now translate that budget into what that means in terms of annual emission reductions, then Scotland needs to deliver 10% per year reductions in emissions immediately. That's a total reduction by 2030 of 75% compared with its current emissions, and zero carbon energy by 2035 to 2040 at the very latest. That's real zero, not net zero. That's all energy from planes, homes, and industry. To bring all of these numbers together now, and think about that in terms of in relation to the Scottish Government's pathway, that pathway itself implies a carbon budget that is 2 to 3 times larger than Scotland's fair carbon budget. Now, if the rest of the world followed Scotland's example, global emissions would be much nearer 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade of warming, not the 1.5 to 2 that was called for in the Paris Agreement. So how from the science do we get such hugely differing results? There are 2 main reasons for this. First, the Scotland's Climate Act assumes a far larger share of the global carbon pie than is really fair. And as a consequence, other poorer nations will have to accept a smaller portion. The Act also chooses to pass a large part of the need to cut our emissions onto our children and future generations, rather than make bigger and deeper cuts in our emissions today.
So I hope that was helpful, but yeah, so this is, yeah, how it gives a good idea for me, if you like graphs, of how dire the situation is. The Carbon Brief website is excellent. It's got a lot of really good material on it. So I encourage people to sort of have a look at that and do your own research. But essentially, this graph is sort of interactive on their website, and you can see if we'd started cutting emissions in 2000, the area under the curve would have allowed us to kind of come down quite slowly. But because emissions have gone up, we face a much steeper curve. And yeah, I mean, you wouldn't have realised Scotland had so much of a bigger footprint, but that's how it works out. So on the Facebook group, I posted some questions. I dare say many of you maybe haven't seen these, but it was just to get an idea of what the kind of understanding was in the village. So I'll just sort of give you an overview of what the responses are. But the first question being, what is your current knowledge of the effects of climate change? And most popular answer here was kind of what I've seen on TV, followed by good. So some people reading up on it. And I guess that's kind of good to know, because I think going forward, we think part of this group is definitely about climate literacy and allowing people to understand more about it. This one here, how quickly do we need to get to zero carbon? So most of the answers here were net zero by 2045. The next most popular was net zero by 2030. One person put real zero by 2030. So as you can hear from Kevin Anderson's talk, you know, we need to be somewhere between sort of net zero by 2030 and real zero by 2030. You know, him saying we've got 6 to 9 years of current emissions. So it really depends how quickly we reduce, but we also need to be really careful about the word net. You know, carbon offsetting schemes can be filled with problems, so they need to be carefully assessed, and I think that's something we'll talk about at some point. Some great responses on why did you join Zero Carbon Daviot. Everyone pretty much wants to get involved to help with community projects and yeah, to reduce their own carbon footprint, so that's great. And here, just to sort of see if people understood their own carbon footprint, I asked what people thought was their biggest one here, and home heating was the most popular answer, followed, I think, by food consumption. And that's actually pretty accurate. So it's interesting because I know that the Passive House Institute did some research in Europe where they, you know, where actually, you know, in a much warmer climate in most of Central Europe, and people usually thought that their highest carbon footprint was their car, and there was a huge perception gap where even in Central Europe, the biggest part of people's carbon footprint is home heating, which really highlights the need to decarbonise home heating and insulate our buildings better.
So, as Matt was saying, our collective governments, Scottish and UK governments, are actively working towards net zero. But as Matt pointed out, it's not true zero, and it's just useful to be aware of the difference between actually creating carbon by being here and sequestering or getting rid of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. But what's happened is the UK government have published their white paper, which is powering our net zero future. And the Scottish government have published their, this green one in the middle here, which is update to the climate change plan. But that is really out for consultation along with the thing on the right there, which is Net Zero Nation. So they'll take comments from people about this document. They'll take comments from the Scotland's Climate Assembly, and they will then move forward. Probably the thinking is that not in this session of Parliament, but after the next elections, they'll be in a position to move forward, which is all taking time. Next slide, please. Yep, so Scotland's Climate Assembly is something that Matt mentioned earlier that I'm attending as an observer. And it's a new idea in Europe for having assemblies of people, citizens assembly, where the Scottish government sent out 10,000 applications for anybody be interested. And from that, they've chosen 100 people who are randomly chosen to sit in and listen to different opinions on how we should tackle climate change. So it's a bit like members of the public being invited to a jury, and they listen to the evidence from the different sides on the climate change challenge, from these expert witnesses and advocates, as they're called. and then they'll make these non-binding recommendations, which will be sent forward to Parliament, who have promised that they will create an action plan. So it's not really that the government will have to follow it, it just helps to get the debate going in the country. Next one, please. So what they've done is they've it's such a vast area of climate changes, you know, the things we can do. So they've kind of split it down to things like diet and lifestyle, which includes kind of agriculture, homes and communities, which is stuff that Matt and I got involved with to begin with, such as you know, renewable energy and insulating homes, and then work and travel, which you know, covers the things that aren't actually there, as Matt said, like air and sea travel. Next one, please. So Community Energy Scotland is where it started for me when I first met Matt. And this is a series of webinars that sounded really interesting, and they are. And so Matt and I have been attending them since last year. There we go, started on the 16th of September. And we've learned a lot about what is available out there for communities that want to address the carbon issue. So this is a bit more focused than the whole of climate change, but it's to do with, as you can see there, the titles at the top: Community Energy Futures, Low Carbon Transport, and then Making It Happen was the interesting bit, because that's how we as a community can actually get some of these technologies for our community, for our benefits and for the climate's benefit. And then they moved on to smart homes and buildings, then low carbon heat and smart networks. So that kind of covered insulating buildings and renewable energy, which it would be heat pumps and wind generators, solar panels, and how these all happen. And then smart networks was the last one we did, which is extremely interesting, because it means that at the moment, people like Mackie's can't put any more wind generators up because the grid is entirely full. But with these smart networks, it may be possible to add on additional generation, but we'll talk about that a wee bit later. So next one is, one of the sessions was presented by the Huntly Development Trust, Huntly and District Development Trust. And they started way back in 2008, I think it was 2009. And they put together various projects for Huntly. But they got to a stage where they just kind of ran out of steam, and people were maxed out in, you know, attending fundraising. And so somehow, and we have yet to find out how, they got some funding, and they bought a little croft outside Huntly, and they put a wind generator on it, and they generated income. Then certain things changed, and one of the local farmers who put up a second wind generator shared it with the community. So that gave them an income, I think they said, of £3 million over 10 years, which is great, because a lot of work that we could do is grant funded, but you need to provide 50% of the cash up front first. So this has allowed Huntly to just launch into lots of different projects because they've got the 50%. So there's as Matt's put up there, that's just an example of some of the stuff that they do. But you know, they have a car club. They bought 4 e-bikes some time ago. They now are up to about 20 or 30 e-bikes. They are buying buildings in the town, which was just basically poor Huntly was falling apart after the supermarkets were built on its outskirts. But they are now purchasing these buildings and repurposing them. And it's just been an absolute tremendous success. So one of our plans is to very early in the next few weeks is to get Huntly to present this to us in this way as a Zoom meeting, so that everybody can see what they've done and we can ask them how they did it. Next one, Matt. Down south, this is Swaffham here, and Swaffham Prior rather, and they have come together as a village, and they are kind of at the forefront of these sort of energy ideas. So, I mean, is it 9 million, Matt, something like that, for 150 houses? So it's about 60 grand a house. So it's a bit on the high side, but just shows you one of the benefits of being early adopters of this stuff from a community point of view, because we all will have to do something as communities, and I think it's just better if we make the choices ourselves. This I'll kind of pass back over to Matt again here, but what we were thinking of is possible projects for Daviot. We could have solar PV on community assets. Do we speak to the hall committee and get solar panels on the hall? Do we put up sunshades over the car park and put solar panels on those? Should we go for a wind turbine? Find a bit of land somewhere and get an income like Huntley? What do we do about insulating our homes? I mean, there is funding there available at the moment, but it's so difficult to chart your way through getting the funding. Most people just give up. Should we have an electric car club? Speaking to somebody after the last meeting, and they went, nah, not really. And then they thought, well, hang on a minute, if we had an electric car sitting outside the village hall, we'd probably get rid of our second car, which is fine if you're actually in the village. But I suppose if you're over at Mackey's, you'd have to cycle here first. Sorry. Better walking and cycling infrastructures. There were plans to put a cycle route between Inverurie and Old Meldrum, and we could quite easily hook onto that through our lanes, which, if they were just made a wee bit safer, would be possible. But there are issues there with 14 landowners, none of whom want it to happen. So, they've got valid reasons why they don't want it. I mean, I don't think I'd particularly be happy if somebody put a footpath through my back garden, but there's ways and means around this, and we just need to work with everybody in the community and sort these things out. And as Matt said, climate literacy is very important, because I think a lot of us came into this thinking, well, we've seen Greta on the TV, there's something there that's upsetting her really badly, we hear it all the time. But what is it really? Because like in my case, I'm going, well, how can it be so bad to have all these cattle? Because before they were there, the steppes of Russia and North America were roaming with buffalo and bison. So it's just good to to understand what the arguments are and how it can help us. So I think there's that. Yeah. What's the next one, Matt? So we thought that if we set up this charity to not just concentrate on the energy ideas that we got from Community Energy Scotland, but to widen it out to tackling the whole of climate change projects, we just thought we could not do all this ourselves, but we could create subgroups. So we're creating a charity where we can have these subgroups and just everybody can work together on it, but we have specialist areas. We also, as Matt said, would like to help with carbon literacy, and one of the ways we plan to do that is to create a website, and it will be regularly updated with any news that's relevant, and also provide a source of information for anybody to go into, because although we've got the Facebook group at the moment, it's often very difficult to find stuff in there if you want to dip back in. So I think that's right. So
thanks, Ken.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So over to you then, Matt.
Yeah. So at our first meeting, we just wanted to get an idea of the level of interest in the village, and generally there's been quite a strong response, which is great. And yeah, lots of people sending in emails with ideas and so on. So we'll need to, prioritize them and so on. But yeah, personally, I think we've got a lot of expertise in the village, and we've got a lot of kind of community assets, for want of a better word, that we could make more of our location and Yeah, so I'd just like to essentially kind of open it up to the floor and, you know, try and answer some of these questions, like, you know, what sort of projects do you think we should undertake? You know, what other things are maybe on the go that we don't know about? We've had some great input from the guys at Mackey's so far about their setup, which has helped us to understand the local grid a bit better. Yeah, any skills that help with this? I mean, we know we've got a lot already, but please speak up. In terms of next steps, just quickly, I'll explain that, yeah, we, since our last meeting, we've managed to get enough trustees to form a Scottish charity. And so we're in the process of writing a constitution, which Ken is drafting up. And obviously we'll share all that with the membership. But obviously that is also put together by the feedback you give us here today as well. So then, yeah, we've got a volunteer to help us build the website. So yeah, we're kind of pressing ahead. So yeah, over to anyone. Yeah, please either unmute yourself or just ask a question in the chat. And yeah.
Yeah, Matt, hi.
Hey, mate.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think it's a very worthwhile initiative. Impressed. I think there's an awful lot of things that went through my head. I was listening to that. I mean, I've been an architect and a sometime environmentalist since the 70s when I qualified, and have a fairly sanguine outlook on what's happened during my career. You kind of can get kind of depressed about the actual results of what's, I mean, we've known this for so long. But having said that, there's always hope. And there are always other ways of approaching it as well, like there are low-tech solutions. For example, in the 1970s, our houses were at an average of about, heated to an average of about 13, 14 degrees. In the 80s, it went up to 20 degrees, and then 21 degrees. And now a lot of us are heating our houses to 23 degrees. Now, for every 1 degree of temperature that we can reduce our heating, we save 10% of our heating bills. So, you know, there are low-tech solutions as well. Just wear a jumper type of thing. And I think, you know, there's a whole basket of things that maybe in terms of when you're looking for information or publishing stuff on websites, then we can come in from all different directions.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Totally agree. Yeah, and insulation is one of the best ways to overcome some of this stuff as well. But yeah.
Yeah, and there's an argument to say, you know, why insulate a whole big volume when you can just insulate yourself? Sounds silly, but that's what we're used to do, you know.
Yeah. It's like a lot of the other big climate change issues is behavioural change.
Yeah.
I think you're quite happy with insulating buildings, though, Mick, aren't you? Because I remember working on one with you there.
Of course I am, Ken. Of course I am. But when you get the figures, like for example, you know that heating probably is one of the biggest major factors in terms of our CO2 emissions, and yes, you think we have to change. We have to change.
Yeah. But I mean, that one that you designed, the office block, and I think they've used for heating, I don't know, it's something like a quarter of their tank in 2 years, LPG tank. I mean, it's just
very impressive. Yes,
just minimal. Yeah,
it's depending on how you calculate it, it's net zero if you take into account the contributions from the rocks, or what it used to be called the rocks. But it almost gets there without that.
Yeah.
Here, I have a question. First of all, thanks very much for your presentation, both Matt and Ken. It was very clear. A couple of different things. You identified, Ken, that Mackies have already got several turbines and they can't install any more because they may overload the grid. How would that affect us if we were to decide to put up our own turbine?
Yeah. Okay. So Marion will back me up on this, that Mackies are completely maxed out. But what we learned in our last session with Community Energy Scotland is we had a guy on from Scottish and Southern Energy Network, and that's like you have the national grid up to the substation, and then beyond that you've got the district network operator, or DNO. Now these guys are not used to balancing the grid at all. The grid's all balanced big style between the power stations and the substations, and these guys just make sure that the power wires go everywhere. Now there's new smart technology available where they can actually monitor the amount of electricity that's being used in an area, and they can then trim the amount that's being generated if you have these so-called ANMs fitted, which is active network management. And the way they're going forward is they're saying, right, well, you know, we're maxed out, but we'll give you 90% of what you generate, you'll get paid for that. But the last 10%, we're going to turn it up and down and trim it to suit our network. And you think, well, if it's maxed out, how does that work? Well, the reason it's maxed out is because what they do at the moment is they will count all the houses and say, right, each house needs that much, that much, that much, all the way across. And then they add it all up and they go maxed. Now, if I use the water analogy, because I used to be in pumps, and it's like if you've got a hotel and you're designing a pump that feeds all the showers. So you say, right, 20 litres a minute for every shower, 200 showers, multiply it up, that's how much we need. Well, no, because the showers aren't all on at the same time. You know, some people shower in the morning, some at night. And even when they shower in the morning, people still get a shower and it might just be not so much pressure, and they accept that. So that's the way that the system works, is that these guys who don't do it at the moment, but they are learning to become balancers of the local grid. There we go. Now here's an example, which is, so two examples. So Scottish and Southern Energy have got, they learned all their tricks on this in Orkney, and you can see by the zone numbering where it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and they went, oh, hang on, when zone 2 is not big enough, we'll call it 2A and 2B. You know, so that is where they discovered how to do it, because Orkney has got an interconnector, as they call it, back to the mainland, but it just was not suitable for them to be able to use all their wind generators, which they've got up there. So they created this zoned area, and the whole thing is balanced locally outside, if you like, the national grid. It was then successful, so they rolled it out for the Isle of Wight, where the interconnector really was maxed out. And again, it's been so successful there that the whole of the south of England now is going on to this ANM, because, you know, the entire, what's it called? SCAN, is it, or SCRAN or something? So they are using it in the south of England, and Scottish and Southern Energy are you know, putting all their efforts down there. But we are in the early throes of speaking to Aberdeenshire Council to find out how we could do this in our area. They were in negotiation with SSEN a couple of years ago, but it seems to have fizzled out. So we're trying to unfizzle it at the moment. Right now, can you just explain that one, Matt? I forgot what the different colours are.
This is a website of SSE Networks, and ignore the colours actually, but obviously we're here in Daviot in the middle, and these are the various sort of substations and grid supply points that we get our electricity from. So Mackies take their supply up to 5E, and the connection at 5E is listed as constrained, which means that yeah, you can't put any more sort of supply or load on the grid there. Old Meldrum is also constrained. We're constrained here at Kemney and over at Inch as well. It's a bit more organic than this. You can go into a bit more depth, but essentially, yeah, we're going to have to. It's quite apparent that this A&M is going to be required, so that's why I've started making inquiries with the council and with SSE as well.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting fact that we learned that the UK government, who are responsible for the grid network, actually spend more on distributing electricity around the United Kingdom than they do on roads. It's a huge part of the budget. Yeah,
but this A&M, is I mean, it's revolutionary in some ways, because they reckon they've, if you wanted a new grid connection, I think the problem with Orkney was if they didn't have A&M, they would have needed another subsea cable that would have taken, was it 5 or 10 years and cost 50 million quid? Yeah. So, these A&M devices are significantly cheaper. So they reckon they've saved 90 years of waiting time by installing these devices in other places. So, and significantly reduce the cost as well. So, so yeah, we're pursuing that.
So the second part of my question was, if we cannot afford to buy any land, would the Shire Council be willing to support us in basically allowing us to erect a turbine over by Pitcaple Quarry or somewhere else that's owned by the Aberdeenshire Council?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I think Matt attended a meeting last week where, was there some group had purchased land for purposes? Yeah.
There's various climate groups all around us, and there's a sort of consortium group above that that's being called North East Scotland Climate Action Network. We had one of their sort of introductory meetings. It's in the process of being set up at the moment, but we had a little 5-minute introduction from I think there was 18 separate groups from and one of them was called Sea Change, who are based in Colliston, and they managed to get a grant of 170,000 from the Scottish Land Fund to purchase 20 acres and a church on the edge of Colliston to use for climate measures. They're turning most of it into a forest and turning the church into a sort of activity centre. So yeah, I mean, I hadn't really considered council land before, but that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, the ones I guess that come to mind up till now was farmers or other people in our community, or yeah, suggestions welcome.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, Nick, thanks very much for your email with all the suggestions on it. Really very helpful. Thank you. We've done our best to incorporate and think about most of the points on that. Well, all of the points, really.
I'm James. I was just thinking during that what with the possibility of putting in some, you said one of the ideas was putting in solar panels near the village hall. Is there any possibility of like using the revenue from the electricity from that to fund future projects as well? And then that way it could also be used to power a community car or put in more electric charging stations like at the village hall as well. It could kind of serve a couple of different purposes possibly, but I don't know if it's very practical because I know they take quite a while to start earning revenue, like they're more expensive. And
yeah, no, thanks, James. Yeah, totally agree. I think that's one of the sort of easiest infrastructure projects we could do, actually. And yeah, I mean, people's lifestyles have changed a lot recently. I know 2 of my neighbours have got rid of their second car because they just don't need it anymore. and at our last meeting there was quite a lot of sort of interest in a car club. So can I just ask for a quick sort of show of hands, if there was like one of these car clubs, do people think that they might use it?
Yeah.
Any interest? Yeah, yeah, possibly. Yeah, yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, so the car clubs that normally happen around here are, sorry, what are they called? I forget the name of them. Co-wheels. So I think it'd be good to get a chat from Co-wheels at some point. But yeah, one of our trustees is Nick Forbes, who's on the whole committee. So yeah, I think I don't know if Ken explained or if we explained, but Community Energy Scotland, as for going on this course, they're giving us £2,000 of grant money and a week's worth of their staff time. So essentially, we've kind of thought that the best way to spend that £2,000 to start with was community engagement. But really, I don't think that actually costs a hell of a lot. So yeah, perhaps we can use some of that for doing a feasibility study on the whole.
Yeah, definitely. And certainly the community trust were very interested in something similar, if we could arrange that. And whereas I don't think there'd be much appetite to stick a wind generator up next to the to the shed up there. I don't think anybody would be too worried about a few solar panels.
And I like the idea of the sunshades as well. I think that'd be a really good way to.
Yeah, it's very common in Germany in supermarket car parks. They cover them with these things, and it keeps the snow off the ground and the sun off the ground, and of course generating power all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, explain some of the ideas that have come in on email. Micro hydro was another great suggestion.
Yeah.
That we could possibly look at in some of the streams and rivers around us.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. Yeah, that's a good one, because traditionally micro hydro, you required a big head of water, high, a lot of fall. But these ones that you suggested are fine in just without the same pressure drop.
Yeah, that's right. All it relies on is a 1.5 meter fall, and it works through a vortex principle.
Yeah.
And it could be built as a cascade system on one bank or both banks of the river, so it still allows fish to swim up.
Yeah, perfect. There it is. Interestingly, at Daviot Estate, there would have been a ram pump fitted many years ago. So not a huge volume, but there is certainly water power available there.
Yeah, I was involved in the one installed at Donside paper mill for the housing estate there, which is it works really well. It's a good thing. Gives the fish a bit of a headache when they go through it, but apart from that, it's a set of screws.
All right. Is that mounted on the old canal then, at the side of the river?
It's actually on. Yes, it's on a weir that came off the Don to serve the paper mill, and then went back into the river.
Yeah, that's the remnants of the old Inverurie to Aberdeen Canal.
That's right.
Thomas Tate kept it for feeding the water into the paper mill.
Yeah. So
that's going to be a good flow there. It'd be interesting to go and see that. Yeah.
Oh, it's big. It's 3 large screws. I can't remember what it actually generates, but it was supposed. I did it. It was 280 houses, I think, at Donside Paper Mill, there or thereabouts, and it was supposed to be able to feed them all, but I don't think it does.
Donside, sorry, I thought you meant
Donside.
Yeah, sorry, Don. I thought you meant the Inverurie Paper Mill.
Oh no, not the Inverurie Paper Mill.
No,
Donside.
sorry. Yeah, they still need a lot of water though, paper mills. Yeah.
Morning, folks. It's Paul here. I quite liked the conversation earlier on where you were talking about actually reducing the amount of energy usage, Mick. So what about actually helping the community look at the insulation in their houses? So it's one thing to turn the temperature down, but actually looking at insulation in the houses and trying to target that. as a, your first starting point should be to reduce energy rather than generate more, better way.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, Paul, your microphone, it's not very clear.
Is that any better?
That's better, yeah,
That's
fine.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, well, I would certainly agree with you that the cheapest form of energy is actually saving it.
Yeah,
sorry.
exactly.
Is saving it. And with insulation, it's very, very important that there's attention to detail. So as well as being sometimes difficult to get hold of funding, it's where Matt said both he and I are trained to be retrofit coordinators. You really need to look at the whole system of a house. You can't just put something in now and hope it will be okay later. For example, if you put in wall insulation but didn't insulate the floor, then you have to lift the floors and you have to take the wall insulation out to get to the floors, something like that. So the plan of retrofit coordination, which is not really been taken up in Scotland, it's part of the grant funding requirement in England, is that you take any house and you work out what is required to reduce the energy consumption in terms of heating, water, and the space heating. But also you've got to look at leaks through the fabric, because in the 1980s, NASA insulated a lot of their buildings and couldn't understand why they were 80% of what they should have been. And they discovered that there were air leaks. And generally you get leaks between where the walls join together, where the walls join to the ceiling, and where the walls join to the floor around window frames. And it's all so easy to sort, you tape it up. It's just so simple. But, builders are not really trained in those finer arts, and it just doesn't happen. So once you've sealed up your house, then, you're essentially living inside a sealed bag, and you've got to have some form of ventilation. And people kind of don't like the idea of mechanical ventilation or heat recovery, where you take the heat out of, or the stay layer out of the house, and then you use that to warm the air coming back in. And they go, well, I couldn't really live in a system with mechanical. And I go, well, every time you sit in the car, you're breathing mechanically ventilated airspace, because otherwise your windows would steam up. So it's really is, it's certainly worth doing, but it's got to be done right. And that's where, we feel that we could help the community in making sure that, if anybody launches into this project, as I've done here in my house, as Mick's done for his places, is just attention to detail, get it right, and we will get the savings. And that is really the way forward.
Well, for me, it's a good starting point, but it kind of depends on, getting it right, as you say, the attention to detail. And problem for many people is they just don't understand all of the detail that is required. So educating people and helping people would be, sounds like it would be a good use of your and Matthew's skills.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I'll second that, and having done the passive house designer course, I can attest to exactly everything Ken's saying there. We lose up to 50% of the energy in our homes. We can lose via pour through drafts and infiltration, as it's called. So and the passive house standard has a retrofit part of it called Enefit, which can reduce. I'm doing a study on this, a dissertation for my master's on converting housing in Aberdeen to this, and essentially, it could reduce the energy consumption of housing by 90%, which brings lots of people out, brings everyone out of fuel poverty. But also, if we're going to electrify the grid, if we're going to electrify home heating, which is what we've got to do through either heat pumps or just plain electric heating, to get rid of gas and kerosene, there isn't enough energy on the grid if we just switch over now. Like, we have to insulate first. And just to share a couple of sort of things on this topic. So Ken's talking about this new standard called, can you see that?
Yeah.
Past 2035. So this is a standard where it gets rid of the man who knocks on your door saying, do you want some insulation? And it ensures that there's a quality controlled process for making installations and doing retrofits. And another thing I'll just share is a company called Energy Sprong, who started in Holland, and they are turning deep retrofits, as they're called, so close to passive house level retrofits. They're turning it into a kind of factory-based model, where essentially they can take a row of houses and manufacture. So this house in the middle here has been done where it's basically been wrapped in a new skin. So it's new roof, new walls. The tenants didn't have to move out. The conversion was done in 1 week. And essentially all the new services are contained in these panels that wrap around the building. And the most interesting thing about all this is actually the funding mechanisms for it. So they've set up some really interesting funding schemes where in a social housing situation, the tenants have basically, they've not moved out and they've continued to pay the same sort of fuel bills and things before and after retrofit, but a sort of loan arrangement's been set up where essentially the cost of doing the work is covered by the ongoing payments from the tenant after the fact. So, you know, they don't experience too much disruption, they get a warmer home for it. And in doing this in like a factory setting, they're doing they're reducing the energy footprint of some buildings by 80 or 90% for a cost of about 60 or 70,000 pounds, which is, you know, really cheap for that level of retrofit. So
yeah, that is the challenge though, is how we help folks do that type of thing and afford it as well.
Yeah, in our case, you see, we live in a timber frame house, and you can't really clad it on the outside because you can't seal it. So we took the plasterboard off the outside walls and put the insulation back in properly all the way around, and it was very disruptive. In retrospect, we should have just, you know, got a larger firm in and done it in one go and just moved out, which would have been fine, really. But it's a tricky thing to do. And the other problem is that the Scottish government at the moment gives you grants for some things and not for others. So that's why, you know, retrofit coordination is so important, is because you really don't want to paint yourself into a corner and not be able to take up the improvements at a later stage.
Yeah.
Matt, when we've got James here, Josh spoke the last time about food, and that James might have some extra information, so it might be worth asking him about that.
Yeah, James, you haven't really properly introduced yourself.
Yeah.
What do you do?
I'm just staying in the village. I went to University of Stirling and did environmental science. So I've just got a bachelor's degree in that, and I've been looking into the prospect my brother was saying about, he'd mentioned a food forest last time, and I thought that was a really interesting idea. There were I did a semester abroad, and a few people were implementing food forests on Vancouver Island in Canada. So I was looking into the potential for that to be implemented here. And I spoke to Sonia McPherson, who's a local farmer, and she was basically giving me some guidance and about the types of plants that grow here and some of the priorities for the local area. And after discussion, like, maybe a food forest is still viable, but it seems like the main limiting factor here in terms of a food forest, where you've got lots of different layers of plants and you've got, they're basically all meant to be edible or nitrogen fixing, that promote the health of the whole system, grow a lot of food, all help each other grow together. But the main limiting factor here might be sunlight, because a lot of plants really need as much sunlight as they can get. So some layering might be possible, but it's possible that that large canopy with smaller trees, with raspberry canes, with all these different layers might just limit the sunlight too much on the lower plants, which are really going to yield well and grow well around here. So I think that the priorities might just be like maximizing diversity and trying to promote the health of the soil as much as possible to sequester carbon, and limiting the use of like pesticides and fertilizers, and to kind of, yeah, promote carbon sequestering into the soil and maximizing plant diversity and pollinators to encourage bee health, for just all the local crops and all of the local pollination that happens. And I think that, yeah, some sort of pollinator patch. I was talking to Sonia and she said that a great way to start would be a herb garden, some fruit trees and local crops that do really well, some raised beds, a pollinator patch for bees. And there's also, I've been doing a little bit of research, and I'm unsure how viable it is with the specific varieties, but there are some like mushroom logs that you can buy, which grow specific types of mushrooms that bees actually like to eat, and it protects them against different viruses that affect their, like deformed wing virus, which affects colony collapse disorder and is a massive threat to essentially food production around the world. And it seems like in an agricultural area that protecting the bee health could have really large effects on food production and food security.
Do they have something similar to that at the Buzzard Cafe? I know they have raised beds there and they grow lots of vegetables and fruit, but I'm not quite sure if it's the same line that you're talking about.
Yeah, the Buzzard Cafe is really, really a good setup. Like they've got a lot of food production and they're doing really well. It's really cool to see. Yeah, I think that the main thing here is, well, yeah, like Sonia was saying, the sunlight really, and making sure that you can grow all these crops. And if you're going to try and do some, well, if there was to be some layering, it's kind of like, yeah, also maximizing the yield of food and the diversity in like a given space. So I think some layering is definitely important for just maximizing that space. And it's possible to do some raised beds underneath some larger fruit trees, or there are a lot of different varieties which do grow here well. It just seems like they need some sunlight.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we kind of thought that there might be a way of multi-cropping between solar panels and something underneath, you know. But we need to get a group going with the farmers around here, because there's a movie on Netflix at the moment called Kiss the Ground. And it's interesting, but it seems to be kind of lacking in any references to, you know, to the science that backs it up. I've emailed the guys, and the answer I got back was, well, you know, when you were at college, probably they didn't mention soil health. And I thought I was a bit cheeky because he's suggesting I'm a bit old. But it's true, and I think we need to engage with the farmers in the community to, you know, to just see how feasible it is, because, you know, one thing that we can do in working with the farmers is they actually have the means of sequestering carbon dioxide, because, you know, a healthy soil is almost as good as, you know, it's being cultivated is almost as good as having a forest, because forests, you know, sequester, cut down, whereas, you know, if you've got a healthy soil, then that's sequestering carbon dioxide all the time. But if you look at the National Farmers website, they're still sort of tickling about in this stuff that we've been hearing about for years. Oh, well, you know, we're reducing our polythene film or something like that, you know, just things that are, you know, just polishing the surface and not really getting down to it. I mean, have you got any thoughts at all, Marion, on this stuff? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute. I can't hear you, Marion. Sorry. No, can't hear. Sorry, Marion, you're on mute. Lovely. That's it. Good. Thank you. Sorry, we didn't catch any of that.
No, I'm saying maybe I'm not the best person because I mean, well, one, I'm a farmer's wife. We have cattle. We have quite a bit of black plastic wrapping straw at the moment. So we could. I know we could do a little bit more to help. But it's just for us. That's our livelihood. So I mean,
yeah, and I think that's where some of this goes a wee bit wrong, because I've discussed this at length with Matt and others, in that, you know, this has got to be an inclusive thing, and I think we've got to get the farmers on board sooner rather than later, because, you know, they have potentially the biggest input to this compared with any of us. But you know, what you read on or hear on the TV at the moment is that, you know, we've all got to become vegans, which is, you know, possibly one way of doing it. But, you know, if you're farming up in the hills, there really aren't many options for you, except for some sturdy cattle or some sheep. You know, you're not going to be ploughing it up for cereal crops. So, but I mean, although I spent some time as an agricultural engineer, I'm completely out of date, and it would be great if we could just get some active and strong input from the local farmers to explain to us what, you know, the difficulties are with the ideas. Not what James was talking about, because that's kind of smaller scale, but, you know, on a larger scale.
Yeah, and I do think that larger scale is really one of the most important things. Like, it's only going to make so much of a difference if there's a tiny little community garden in the local area. But I think that, you know, there's so much potential for all the fields and farmers and so many people that live around about that are so involved and live on the land that it just is. Yeah, there's so much potential.
Yeah.
Willie, were you trying to say something there?
I mean, just to sort of carry on at that point, that there are lots of sensitivities and included in our own homes. That, you know, we drive a diesel. We live in the northeast where it's cold and we've got heating, and all of us, to take Paul's point, I think, can learn by turning things down, understanding the sensitivities, and helping. And the National Farmers Union, we live in a community that's thrived, you know, and benefited from the oil and gas industry as well. All things we need to kind of reconcile in our minds and work out how to move forward. And oil and gas industry, National Farmers Union, and farmers have all shown there's been a real sea change in recent times, and, you know, it's understanding what all of those things are and where we can help and collaborate with people, I think, is really important. And change, you made the point, Matt, you know, behaviours, our own behaviours make a big difference in what we can do.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll say that, you know, I think it's really important, and we're trying to sort of write it in the constitution as such, that we try and involve the skeptics in our village as well, you know, not just people who believe in it, talking in an echo chamber, sharing ideas, but we need, it doesn't work without everyone being involved. So
yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, you know, it's education, it's input from all different you know, branches. I drive a diesel as well. I was encouraged to buy diesels 20 years ago. Big time. You know, the situations like that. It's education is so important. And the small community garden, you know, it's community forest. It doesn't matter what scale it's at. If it gets people involved and put ideas into people's heads, then it's done its job. You know, it's absolutely, yeah.
Even the kind of, this was talked about to start with, speaking to Keith Duncan and what he went through to think about buying his latest electric car, was just listening to him for 5 minutes was really informative. And so I think just wee pieces like that of different kind of angles to help us all understand the options available to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also, I think a good thing to integrate with the Zero Carbon Daviot group is maybe the Sustainable Development Goals. You can kind of list what your goals are in line with the UN have set these goals of, you know, the more people that get on board, the better. And I think that listing what our goals are in line with the Sustainable Development Goals is like would be really good for showing like the validity of the movement, I guess.
Matt will be pleased to hear that.
We were talking about this yesterday in context of the Constitution, actually, James. So, yeah, for those who haven't heard of them, the UN Sustainability Goals are these 17 goals. Just Google it. But yeah, key to bringing equity and everything to a climate argument.
I think, though, if we were to share that to the skeptics, it would become worse because they would say that it was unachievable. So I think our goals have to be achievable, and then they can be progressive, and we can potentially improve each year.
Mm-hmm. Yes, food for thought, how to engage people.
Yeah, that's also what you said, Matt. You have to have smart objectives. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there was a lot of interest in our last meeting about community gardening as well. Most people probably don't realise it, but we do kind of have a little community garden down by the DCT land. Sean, who owns the land down there, did start well, there is a kind of vegetable patch there, which he did offer up to some people in the community. So we're planning to try and engage with him and see, yeah, if he's happy for further sort of engagement.
Yeah, I almost wonder if like talking about the environmental skeptics and the Sustainable Development Goals, if it is best to kind of leave that out, or if it's best to have that as like the overarching goal and then break it down into manageable steps to kind of set like a roadmap for how we want to kind of do our part towards that, to kind of frame it in a bigger perspective, or if it is best just to leave it in.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two levels here. There's one is where we try to do the Constitution, which doesn't exclude anything, but it's got to be reasonably, achievable. But once we've got that, then we can drill down and we can, select the projects that are most appropriate to the village. That, well, I guess we'll be going for the big hitters first, to be perfectly frank, because it's not just that it's easier; it'll have the most impact.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for me, some of this is going to happen whether they like it or not. Some of it will be mandated. There's a government target for all homes to be EPC C and above. So, if we're there to support some of these things, then hopefully we'll just be seen as a force for good by these skeptics. Perhaps, I don't know.
That was the point I was making regarding the Aberdeenshire ground, because with the Aberdeenshire Council ground, that's on the one hand, they want all houses to be economically viable, and then on the other hand, it's important that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing as far as the council is concerned, because I think if that's highlighted to them, then they should be supportive of giving us council land to perhaps erect a turbine, or if it's council land where a river flows through, we could erect some kind of turbines.
Yeah, that sounds good. And it's funny, since we've been talking about this, as we go out on our small little walks around the community, I'm looking at every hill and thinking, could we stick a turbine on that? And the one that did come to mind was the hill at the quarry there. But I think the Scottish government got that earmarked for a new motorway to go through, haven't they? So we might have to share with them, or would the wind generator take precedence? I don't know. Yes.
And also, I think that the micro hydros are it's a good idea. One thing that we were doing when I was in Vancouver Island as well, they've had massive dam infrastructure put all around the Pacific Northwest, which has been great because they can, generate all of their electricity using dams. But it's had a massive effect on like the local ecosystem because suddenly the salmon can't get up the rivers, and it's really had pretty devastating effect on the local fish diversity and knock-on effect on all of the ecosystem around there. So I think they're definitely keeping in mind like the species that use the river, and I think that's a really good point you made. Like keeping in mind that the fish can actually still get up the river and everything is really, really important for kind of making sure that there aren't any sort of knock-on effects that then later have to be rectified. It's always hard to plan for those things, but because there usually will be. But it's there's something good to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah. So is there anything we haven't discussed? Oh, yeah, Matt, you were at the end of the slide presentation. There's sort of all the links to what we've spoken about, and I think you were going. That's available, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. On the mailing list, I'll hopefully everyone is on our mailing list. I think you all are, and I'll send out a summary after this, just attaching the slides and a link to the recording on YouTube and stuff like that. So, so yeah, so it's 10:34. I appreciate the sun is shining and people maybe want to go walk their dogs or whatever. Is there any? Yeah, I've got a dog, Dave. Is there anyone we haven't heard from who'd like to speak up? Going once, going twice. Sold, right, okay, we'll go and enjoy our weekend then, shall we?
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, folks.
Thanks very much, and yeah, we'll just watch your emails and we'll send more updates and more events. I think, as Ken said, the next event we'll try and get lined up is a discussion with Huntley. So yeah, I'll be emailing out about that and looking for a suitable time for everyone.
Okay. Yeah, that is a good point. How about timing? Was this okay for everybody here today, 9 o'clock Saturday?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah, it was fine.
Perfect.
Great.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Lovely. Thank you.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Yeah.